Hello, namaste, welcome, good afternoon. Those of you joining me in the room and those of you joining me on Zoom. This is a little Dharma talk I like to call Living from the Heart. I'll start with a poem of mine, go into the talk, and then finish with a short meditation to ground and feel into the lessons of the Dharma. This poem I wrote around the time of the George Floyd protests. People die from hatred, the same that chokes men's necks and leaves them bleeding under heavy boots. Seeds we all have, only silenced with the same love that whispers our souls into being and aligns our one life's desires. One day, maybe today, there will be a dawning, a sweet freshening wrapped in urgency, a shape aching to form from the cloud, a fast-flung and far-out revolution arising from the mist, and the deepest calling of this moment will finally be answered, as simply as the ocean welcoming in the rushing stream. So today's talk will be about a quote from the Dhamma Pada, a lovely book of Buddhist slogans. Now, some people attribute to the slogans in the Dhammapada as coming directly from the Buddha. However, this is up for some debate, as it was largely compiled centuries after the Buddha. But it's a quote I love and often return to, and it goes like this. Hatred does not cease through hatred at any time. Hatred ceases through love and love alone. This is an unalterable law. And when you get into the sacred texts, there's always different ways to translate the same verse. So another one goes, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. And in this talk, I won't talk about any specific geopolitical conflict that's happening right now, but it will be easy to extrapolate it to whatever it is that you might be concerned about, whatever it is that might be pulling on the heart, or even creating a bit of heartache. Because, of course, if you were to listen to this recording 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there will, of course, be a new conflict pulling on people's heartstrings. And it's always interesting listening to a podcast or a talk or a lecture that was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, because it will have the same kind of approach, the same kind of idea. The person who's speaking will say something along the lines of like, wow, so I know we're having a bit of a crisis moment right now. I know we're all having a little bit of trouble with what's happening in the world. And it almost seems like things haven't changed. So we have this idea that hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. And in the Dhammapada, it says this is the eternal rule, the unalterable law. So when I think about this, that was written 2,000 years ago, I wonder, have we learned this? Do we know this? Has it changed? So I remember recently, I was going down one of those kind of Wikipedia rabbit holes, where you click on one thing that you're interested in, and then it follows you down, and you click on another thing that you are interested in. And I remember reading about Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Doors of Perception and largely compiled or kind of came up with this idea of the perennial philosophy. And there was a very short sentence, and all it said was, Aldous Huxley was a pacifist. And I remember reading that thinking, you can do that? That's allowed? You're allowed to be a pacifist? Growing up in America, absolutely, we've been fed all sorts of ideas around how certain war, certain violence is justified. In fact, I read that America has been at war 93% of the time. 93% of its existence, America has been at war. 222 out of 239 years since 1776, America has been at war. So I wonder, have we learned this? Have we learned that hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love? We have a Department of Defense, but we don't have a Department of Peace. So interesting. Have you noticed that? So even when we might be tempted to, say, judge or critique a certain other country's response to certain conflict in the world, I often think of the famous quote from the Bible that we are so quick to point out the splinter in our brother's eye, but not acknowledge the log in our own. So when we think about this unalterable law, our goal really in practice, in spiritual practice, what we do here, the reason we sit and cultivate peace in our hearts is because if we want to stop the war outside, we have to stop the war that is inside. We have to stop the conflict, the hatred that is happening right here in our own hearts and in our own minds. So there's another quote from the Tao Te Ching, and it's Tao Te Ching is often quoted because there's so much lovely words to be found in it, but I don't see this passage quoted nearly as often. Now, interestingly, whenever I kind of look at sacred texts, I'm always a little skeptical of the pronouns. These tend to be written by men, also for men. Sometimes when I do translate the scriptures themselves, I might switch the pronouns from he to she, or perhaps just create gender neutral pronouns or a gender neutral way of expressing these truths. But when I even think about the war and violence that is perpetuated in the world, it does seem to be largely done by one sex. So I think it's appropriate to leave these gendered pronouns in this version of the Tao Te Ching, where it says, "Weapons are the tools of violence. All decent men detest them. Weapons are the tools of fear. A decent man will avoid them, and if compelled, will use them only with the utmost restraint. Peace is his highest value. If the peace has been shattered, how can he be content? His enemies are not demons, but human beings like himself. He doesn't wish them personal harm, nor does he rejoice in victory. How could he rejoice in victory and the delight in the slaughter of men? He enters a battle gravely, with sorrow and with great compassion, as if he were attending a funeral." And later in the Tao Te Ching, it also says, "When you win a war, you celebrate by mourning." I often think about that whenever anyone talks about this idea of winning a war, because a lot of times there is no winners. There's just who has lost less. And we even celebrate winning wars by mourning and mourning the dead. So I don't see that nearly as often. Weapons are the tools of violence. All decent people detest them. Now, in yoga, in the principles of yoga, in the yamas and the niyamas, we have this idea of ahimsa. I often say that in spiritual circles, we love non-words, non-judgment, non-striving, non-attachment. And ahimsa, too, means non-harming. Himsa meaning harm, and the negates it. So non-harming. And is often described as non-violence, and is often upheld as the highest virtue, something we can bring into our lives in a myriad of ways. So the yoga perspective, by and large, for example, is that ahimsa is the argument for vegetarianism. Our goal is to not harm a single creature. So as a result, we don't eat meat. But there are other spiritualities and lineages who have taken ahimsa to a greater extent and a further extent. So you have the Jains, who consider ahimsa to be the fundamental tenet of everything it is that they believe in. So you will see the Jains and they will have little cloths covering their face. This is way before COVID and people wore masks, little cloths covering their face so that they don't unintentionally inhale any organisms. They don't eat any root vegetables, because if you were to pull out the root vegetables, you would destroy the homes of creatures in the earth. They don't even cook at night, because you might unintentionally destroy a sentient being who flew into your soup as you were cooking it. So there are different extents, different ways we can bring ahimsa into our life, different ways we can bring this principle of nonviolence and non-harming into our life. So you even go to some spiritual communities and you'll see monks, and they have their little brooms in front of them. And of course, they are sweeping the ground as they walk so they don't unintentionally step on any ants or other insects as they walk. And in these same communities, you also see ahimsa in materialism, or a different way to approach the materials that we use. Because of course, you might be an excellent vegetarian and you might recycle all of your plastic, but then you of course buy a phone, which was produced in a certain country with certain lax laws around pollution and child labor and different things like that. So suddenly we realize that if we are to bring ahimsa into our life, it's going to affect every area of our life. So, of course, part of cultivating non-attachment is not having so many possessions, or potentially even selling all your possessions. And at the same time, you might go to a meditation community where people are sweeping the ground beneath their feet so as not to unintentionally step on any insects. And you have one bowl. You have one bowl that you use for all of your meals. And when you finish your meal, you would pour your tea into the bowl, you swish it out, and then you drink it. So you have one bowl for all of your meals, all of your drinks, and you eat every last morsel of food that is given to you. And what do you do when your bowl breaks? You grind it up and you put it on those same paths that you then walk upon. It's the ultimate loop. It's the ultimate nonviolence, not creating actions that cause pain and suffering for other beings. So there's even a story of the Buddha. And when I hear this story, I often think of like a movie scene of how this plays out, because there's a notorious serial killer. His name is Angulimala. And Angulimala sees the Buddha over there in the opposite corner of the square, and he thinks, I'm going to kill the Buddha. At that moment, the Buddha stands up and he walks around a corner. So Angulimala chases after the Buddha. As soon as Angulimala gets around the corner, he sees Buddha around another corner, seemingly very far away. He's like, the Buddha is just walking so patiently. How is he so far away? So then Angulimala continues to run and finally gets to the next corner, turns the corner, and of course, the Buddha is at the next corner, already turning the corner. So this happens a few times. There's different interpretations of this story, that the Buddha is capable of, say, teleporting himself across distance. But the point is that Angulimala, eventually, he's panting, he's tired, he's exhausted, he's got his hands on his knees, and he says, stop, Buddha, stop. At this point, the Buddha stops walking. He gets up and turns around and says, what are you talking about? I stopped years ago. I stopped decades ago. I stopped harming any other sentient beings. It is you who have not stopped. And it is said, as these stories go, that in that moment, Angulimala became enlightened and committed to a life of non-violence. There's a prayer I found from Jack Kornfield. He wrote, others will kill. We shall not kill. Thus we should direct our hearts. Others will be cruel. We shall not be cruel. Thus we should direct our hearts. Others will speak falsely. We will speak what is true. Thus we should direct our hearts. Others will be fraudulent. We shall not be fraudulent. Thus we should direct our hearts. Others will be hateful. We shall become loving. Thus we shall direct our hearts. Others will be unwise. We shall become wise. Thus we shall direct our hearts. And I always love that use of the verb direct in that little prayer. Another quote that does come from the Buddha goes, just as the farmer channels water to their own land, so too does a wise person channel love and compassion to their own heart and mind. This basic idea that we are simply directing ourselves to greater love, greater kindness, greater compassion, greater ahimsa, and nonviolence. So when you do hear this word hatred, it can seem like a fairly strong feeling we might have, and maybe we don't feel like we don't have any hatred in our bodies. But it's important to recognize that hatred is considered to be one of the three main poisons to a person's heart. And the common metaphor is that if I were to take an empty glass and put just a drop of poison in it and fill up the rest with water, I will still end up with poisonous water. So even just the slightest bit of hatred, greed, and delusion will begin to poison the heart and mind. So the main way that greed, hatred, and delusion arise is through the desiring mind. So in yoga psychology, desire is the root of suffering. Attachments to our desire is the root of suffering. And a desire manifests in two ways, craving and aversion. Craving and aversion. We either want something or don't want something. And these fundamentally are two sides of the same coin of desire, right? Aversion is just not wanting a certain thing. Craving is just wanting it. So it splits into two directions. And this is where greed and hatred also arise. So if the root cause of our suffering is the desiring and the attachment, it breaks off into two directions, craving and aversion. When we experience obstacles, or when we don't inhibit these feelings, they perpetuate themselves into greed and hatred. So, of course, if we have that craving mind and it continues and it continues, and we accumulate material wealth more and more and more, eventually it turns into greed. On the other side, if we have aversion, if we're continually running from something, then that too is going to create hatred, particularly as it applies to other people. So not only are in spiritual communities are we a big fan of non-words, non-judgment, non-striving, non-attachment, so too we love antidotes. We love figuring out what the poison is and figuring out what is the antidote to cure that poison. So for greed, hatred, and delusion, we have the three antidotes to the three poisons. And those three antidotes are part of the four, hope this isn't confusing, part of the four Brahma Viharas, or divine abodes, or noble qualities. So you might have heard them. We have compassion, we have loving kindness, and we have sympathetic joy. I sometimes think of these as the three ingredients to love, or the three levels of love. These are different qualities of love that change depending on how we interact with other people. So, for example, if someone we know is suffering, then the love that we have for them, the genuine concern for the well-being that we have for them, transforms into compassion, a desire for this person to be alleviated of their suffering. If the love that we have for somebody touches a neutral person, it turns into loving kindness, a friendliness, a natural goodwill. And if the love that we have for somebody touches somebody who's doing very well, like your partner just got a promotion, then it turns into mudita, or sympathetic joy, or joy in that person's joy. So these are essentially the three antidotes. These are what we seek to cultivate in our practice. So even the word for meditation, bhav or bhavana, means a cultivation. It means a coming to be. So in our meditation, we essentially cultivate the garden of our own mind. We plant those seeds of compassion and loving kindness and sympathetic joy, and we water it with our attention, and we're able to watch it grow. So we might have, say, certain level of hatred to somebody who feels a certain way, and we use the antidote of loving kindness in order to extend our friendliness to that person. And when you get into spiritual communities that do practice and espouse these values, you often see almost like monumental feats and monumental abilities to remain friendly, to remain compassionate, even in the most trying of times. So there is a well-known story of a Tibetan Lama by the name of Lopanla. And Lopanla was imprisoned by the Chinese for 18 years and tortured many times to try to get him to denounce his religion. And when finally free, Lopanla came to India and was asked about his experience with the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama asked if Lopanla was ever afraid, to which he replied, yes, many times. Asked when he was afraid, Lopanla replied, I was afraid I might lose compassion for the Chinese. So hatred does not cease by hatred, but only through love alone. And it can be easy to hate people that cause you pain, that cause you suffering. And we can be inspired by stories like this. Even the story of Jesus is very similar. He asked, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We have saints like Lopanla and like Jesus that encourage us all to live with a love of unconditional kindness and compassion. So in cultivating these things, fundamentally, we're seeking to become free. Fundamentally, when you get into Eastern cosmology, we've been born and experienced death many, many times. We are essentially stuck in this world of conditioned existence, stuck in this world of bondage, of samsara. And whether you're stuck to the world with gold chains and you have a very good life, or stuck and bound to the world with iron chains and have a very challenging life, the idea is the same, that we're stuck in bondage, and our fundamental goal is to achieve liberation, is to achieve freedom. So this is the path to get there, not harboring greed, hatred, and delusion. So there's another story of two ex-prisoners of war who met after many years. And when the first one asked, have you forgiven your captors yet? The second man answers, no, never. Well then, the first man replied, they still have you in prison. So when we say suffering or dukkha, our goal is to be liberated from suffering and to find freedom. It's easy to think of suffering as those big monumental things in our life, death, violence, war, famine, disease, that sort of thing. But in yogic psychology, suffering is very simple. Suffering is any time things are not what you wish them to be. So whether your loved one is on their deathbed, or whether you go into the ice cream shop and they're out of your favorite ice cream, there is suffering. We suffer in big ways, we suffer in small ways, and suffering is any time reality isn't what we want it to be. And so too, if we extrapolate this idea to being in prison, you might even say that we are in prison right now, anytime we are in a place that you don't want to be. If you don't want to be in your mind is a prison. If your body is in pain and you don't want to be in your body is a prison. I'll even lead retreats at beautiful paradisal locations out in the world. And, you know, if you go to a hot location and you get some mosquito bites and you have dengue fever and your body is breaking out in hives and you have food poisoning from the bad coconut milk that you had the previous night, even a place like paradise can seem like a prison. So this is our way to liberation, to liberate ourselves from the inability to forgive, inability to be compassionate to all beings everywhere. And it requires a deep commitment. Even ahimsa requires a deep commitment, not to leave anyone out of your heart. So when we say hatred does not cease by hatred, but only love alone, that means bringing love even to the people that you are tempted to, or perhaps even already hate. So you might have heard the path of the bodhisattva, the path of the awakened being. One particular bodhisattva is Kuan Yin, the Chinese version or the female version of Avalokiteshvara. And Avalokiteshvara and Kuan Yin are often described as that which hears the cries of the world. So Kuan Yin is this ultimate goddess of compassion. And Kuan Yin is compassionate to the whole world. Anywhere somebody in the world is crying, Kuan Yin hears it. So there is Kuan Yin's prayer for the abuser. To those who withhold refuge, I cradle you in safety at the core of my being. To those that cause a child to cry out, I grant you the freedom to express your own choked agony. To those that inflict terror, I remind you that you shine with the purity of 1,000 suns. To those who would confine, suppress, or deny, I offer the limitless expanse of the sky. To those who need to cut, slash, or burn, I remind you of the invincibility of spring. To those who cling and grasp, there's craving and aversion. To those who cling and grasp, I promise more abundance than you could ever hold on to. To those who vent their rage on small children, I return to you your deepest innocence. To those who must frighten into submission, I hold you in the bosom of your original mother. To those who cause agony to others, I give the gift of free flowing tears. To those that deny another's right to be, I remind you that the angels sang in celebration of you on the day of your birth. To those who see only division and separateness, I remind you that a part is born only by bisecting a whole. For those who have forgotten the tender mercy of a mother's embrace, I send a gentle breeze to caress your brow. To those who still feel somehow incomplete, I offer the perfect sanctity of this very moment. So I say all this almost implying that it's easy, of which of course it is not. It is not easy to shift from greed and hatred to loving kindness and compassion. It is not easy to offer prayers to the abuser. It is much more easy to have Kuan Yin on your altar, to pray to meditate in front of, to bow down to, than perhaps a politician that you don't agree with. But this is our path. This is our task. As Rumi would put it, our task is not to seek for love, but to remove all the obstacles against it. So you might even put that picture of an annoying coworker or an in-law or a politician that you don't agree with on your altar and say, how can I extend my love and compassion to this person that I disagree with, even this person that I feel like causes me much harm? And this fundamentally is true power. So I often point out that the Spanish word corazón and the root word for courage have the same etymology. From I think it's Latin coere, which means from the heart. If we want to have courage to face even great powers that are against us, we have to come from the heart. So I think about this anytime, of course, I teach power yoga. This is, after all, left coast power yoga. People tend to think of power as like political power or power over other people kind of power. This is not the power that we cultivate. We're looking for an inward power. So another quote from the Tao Te Ching I love is, mastering others requires force. Mastering oneself requires strength. So people often conflate power with force. That's not power. Power is strength. Power is mastering oneself. There is even a story of power where a very well-known, strong, forceful man recently came to power, recently reached the top of the military. So, of course, this man wanted to demonstrate that he was the one in charge. So he went to village after village after village to demand that the villagers and the local population essentially submit to his rule. So as they went around, everyone said, yes, 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 you're in power. You can rule us. We'll do whatever you ask us to. Finally, he went to one particular village where he was told that there was a monk who refused to submit, who refused to acknowledge the power of this military man. So, of course, enraged, he went right to this monk's hut and stood in front of him. And in a big, loud, and booming voice, he said, "Don't you know who I am? I could take my sword and slice you through the belly, and I wouldn't even bat an eye." Upon hearing this, the monk looked up, looked at this military leader, and said, "Don't you know who I am? You could slice your sword through my belly, and I wouldn't even bat an eye." This is true power. This is true nonviolence, a full commitment to nonviolence, even in front of those and to those who wish to do us harm. So this is an aspiration. Don't get me wrong. We can also apply ahimsa to ourselves and not say, judge ourselves for missing the mark of great beings like Kuan Yin. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says, if you want to see the brave, look at those who can forgive. If you want to see the heroic, look at those who can love in return for hatred. Look at those who can love in return for hatred. So in yoga, we do call this the Raja path. Swami Vivekananda says that there are essentially four paths to yoga, what he calls the four paths. There's, of course, other paths, but Swami Vivekananda says that there's four paths to yoga. We have bhakti, the path of love, surrender, and devotion, path of karma, or selfless service, path of jnana, or knowledge, and then the fourth one, which is the one we do right here in the studio, which is the Raja path, the royal path. So Raja is just a good word to know, because if you're looking for the king version of any of your yoga poses, Raja Kapotasana, Raja Natarajasana, king dancers, king pigeons, it's that same Raja. This is the royal path. When people ask what path is the royal path, it's the path of self-discipline and self-mastery. It is that monk sitting there in a full lotus position, at total peace with himself and with the world. So that even if you were to take a sword and slice him through the belly, he would not bat an eye. This is true strength. This is true power. This is true coming from the heart. So we have to look at our coping strategies. We have to look at our suffering. We have to look at when things don't go our way, how do we respond? So this is another quote, and it presents, again, a certain gender binary that I don't necessarily agree with, but there's a little kernel of truth in it. The joke goes, when women get stressed, they shop. When men get stressed, they start a war with another country. Now, again, I don't agree with this gender binary necessarily. However, it points to this basic idea that we all have coping strategies. When we are unable to handle and regulate our own internal world, we seek to regulate it externally. And that, of course, can create a lot of violence in the world. So part of our sitting still is acknowledging and seeing our own reactions to things. So just as we say in meditation, that meditation is noticing the itch without needing to scratch it, so too, meditation is noticing something like anger without necessarily needing to act on it. It's noticing the emotions that arise. Even noticing hatred might arise, and noticing it without acting on it. So that way we can respond to any situation in life with compassion and love, rather than react with judgment, hatred, and violence. There's another saying, give a speech while angry, and it'll be the best speech you'll ever regret. Right? So we know this. You can even look at the brain. You can look at the limbic system, this emotional system of the brain. When you're angry, when your stress response system is activated, it shuts down higher cortical functioning of the brain. You literally flip your lid and you're unable to access those places of theory of mind, of seeing something from another person's point of view, that place of mindfulness, those places of compassion. So part of our practice of just sitting still and noticing our breath is essentially regulating our nervous system, essentially finding a true strength and a true power that is able to see something like anger without necessarily needing to act on it. And potentially, that could even mean funneling our anger into something more productive, like a nonviolent protest, for example. We're not just here just to navel gaze and just notice our anger arise and fall. It's a normal reaction to be angry to certain things that are happening in the world. But are we going to add to that same reactivity? Are we going to add hatred to the hatred that we are seeing in the world? So Edward Wilson wrote, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and God-like technology." Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and God-like technology. So this is where our practice is one of evolution. We do have a flight, fright, freeze, stress response that did serve us in the Paleolithic era. For example, we needed to catch our prey and run from predators, but it's left over. And if we let that stress response system rule our lives, it will end up creating greed, hatred, and delusion. It will end up creating more violence in the world. So bhavana is one way I often think of meditation. It's a matter of tending the garden of the mind. But another word for meditation is the Tibetan word gom, which literally means to become familiar with. It is a familiarization. We are essentially looking within to get to know the nature of our own mind, to get to know our own habitual reactions to things, to get to know the true source of war, to cultivate peace within ourselves if we are to cultivate peace outside in the world. And I always hesitate saying this, but it's like, do you ever go to a peace rally and just wonder why everyone's so angry? And you're just like, is peace going to happen when people are angry, when people aren't able to empathize and be compassionate to others? So the spiritual approach is, if you want to create peace in the world, we have to create peace in ourselves. If you want to stop the war in the world, we have to stop the war within ourselves. So one of my favorite poems by Dorothy Hunt goes like this. Do you think peace requires an end to war, or tigers eating only vegetables? I love that line. Do you think peace requires an end to war, or tigers eating only vegetables? Does peace require an absence from your boss, your spouse, yourself? Do you think peace will come some other place than here, some other time than now, in some other heart than yours? Peace is this moment without judgment. That is all. This moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. Peace is this moment without thinking that it should be some other way, that you should feel some other thing, that your life should unfold according to your plans. Peace is this moment without judgment, this moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. So I have a few more stories, but I want to give time to meditate. So one final thought I want to finish with. So far, we've been focusing on this idea that hatred does not cease through more hatred. And our task is to cultivate a love and compassion for others, even those who say do harm, or those who wish to do us harm. And so you might begin to ask, well, how or why does love heal? Or why is love essentially the answer? Because maybe I do feel like I should be compassionate or loving to someone who I say label as an enemy, but aren't they just going to walk over me? And we have to understand that inside every human being, there is what you might call an untouchable diamond. There is what you might call a pure essence of love. In Buddhism, they call it Buddha nature. That everyone, you, me, your enemy, your coworker, your mom, your dad, we all have Buddha nature. We all have an untouched, unalterable, fundamental, loving nature. And we are appealing to that with our own love. There's another story, two monks walking along, and every day they pass a river, and in the river there's a scorpion that's drowning. And each day, one of the elder monks, of course, as these stories go, picks up the scorpion and sets it down. And as soon as the monk sets it down, the scorpion stings it. Next day, save the scorpion, scorpion sting. Next day, save the scorpion, scorpion sting. Finally, the younger student, he's had enough. He says, why do you keep saving the scorpion knowing it's going to sting you? It is the scorpion's nature to sting you. And the elder monk says, yes, it is the scorpion's nature to sting, and it is my nature to save it. So something people often don't know is that Gandhi's word for his protest, his form of protest that we call nonviolence, is satyagraha. And whenever you hear this word sat, it should light up so many bulbs in the head because we have Satchidananda, we have this idea of truth, we have Satya, another one of the principles of yoga. So sat is this basic idea of truth. And then graha in this case means polite insistence. And what we mean by that is one of the reasons we have not a single ounce of hatred and an unconditional love, even for those who do harm in the world, is we are appealing to the truth and rooted in the truth, that inside every human being, there is Buddha nature, there is Christ consciousness, there is a soul, a spirit, a heart, a source of divinity, or simply a love that we can tap into. So this is what we mean when we say that every human being has Buddha nature. We all have seeds of love and compassion within us. So our task essentially is to awaken each other's seeds, to water each other's seeds. Next time your partner's sad, just think, what are the seeds of happiness and joy and love that I can water in this human being? This is our task. And it can seem overwhelming. So I'll finish with one last story because I love this story so much. One day, a raven was sitting on a branch, and a snowfinch flew over and sat next to the raven. And the snowfinch asked the very wise raven, he asked, how much does a snowflake weigh? And the raven said, oh, just a snowflake? Nothing more than nothing. To which the snowfinch replied, that's so interesting. Because last night it was snowing, and I was counting each little snowflake. And after snowflake 3,349,495, the next snowflake, number 3,349,496, once that snowflake landed, the branch broke and fell. And with that, the snowfinch flew off, and the raven sat there thinking to himself, finally saying out loud, perhaps there is only one voice lacking for peace to come about in this world. So throughout history, there's always a tipping point. There's always a breaking point. Perhaps this world just needs one more voice for there to be peace. So that's what we are here to do, to cultivate one more voice, our voice, to let it be one of peace and one of compassion. Let's come to a straight spine. Relax the shoulders. Close the eyes or soften the gaze. And come into this present moment by taking a few deep, nourishing, and relaxing breaths. And we might ask ourselves, will peace come some other place than here, some other time than now, in some other heart than mine? Peace is this moment without judgment. And we have to start with ourselves, with loving ourselves in this moment. So take a few moments to smile at the heart. Let the heart smile back. Remove the judgments that simply cloud the light of your own loving awareness. And as we breathe deeply and with ease, we can offer ourselves the mantra, inhaling, finding calm, and exhaling, finding peace. With each inhale, we abide in a sense of calm. And each exhale, we breathe out a desire, a wish, an intention for peace in this world. Inhaling, finding calm, and exhaling, finding peace. Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only through love. This is the eternal rule. This is the unalterable law. Let us end the hatred inside ourselves. Let us heal ourselves through love. Tuning within to your own essence, your own Buddha nature, the Guru within, the teacher within. Om Namo Gurudev Namo. You can bow to the true teacher within. Mastering others requires force. Mastering ourselves is true strength. Finding that inner source of power, of courage, of the heart. And that inner light in me, that inner essence in you, honors and recognizes true light in you. When we both come from this place, the illusion of separateness dissolves, and we see ourselves as one. One light, one mind, one turning and burning diamond, one love. Thank you for sharing your practice and presence with me today. Know that you are loved just the way you are. Namaste.